Hey everyone, how's it going? Vanguard Season 5 is finally here, and with that we have the final map for Vanguard Zombies. Aside from a few new weapons added with the Battle Pass, the Archon is the only new addition to the game. And as we'll get into it, calling it a new addition is a bit of a stretch. Point being, the Vanguard Season 5 review is basically just a review of the Archon, so with that in mind, let's get into the review. The first thing you'll notice when playing the Archon is that it probably looks a little familiar. And by a little familiar, I of course mean that it is an exact copy of Terra Maledicta. Aside from a few minor changes and the green filter slapped on top, which we'll talk about later, this is a one-for-one remake of a map released just a few months ago. Granted, Terra wasn't a round-based map, but the map design itself is still the same. And because the Archon is the same as Terra Maledicta, it has all of the flaws of Terra Maledicta as well. The Archon doesn't end up using space exceptionally well. Aside from the stamina perk machine, there's no reason to go to the area with the wrecked train, which is a really big area. The dig sites on the map still don't offer very much value apart from the required Easter egg steps. You get the idea. There's also that ugly green filter that makes the map look genuinely terrible. Visually, this might be the ugliest map ever made, if only because it doesn't fit the theme or location of the map at all. And then there's the faults with the Easter egg, which we'll of course talk about later. But before we get into that Easter egg, it's worth mentioning that there's actually a lot of positives going for this map. There are of course some gameplay improvements that have been made since Terra was released that end up benefiting the Archon. Fighting Zabala isn't nearly as slow as it was when Terra launched, since she no longer has invincibility frames. The Decimator shield got a huge buff to make it an actual viable weapon, not just a wonder weapon, a viable weapon. And of course the Archon is a round-based map and not whatever they were doing before. If you ignore the fact that this is just a round-based version of a map we already have in this exact game, it actually does play pretty well. There's a lot of open space for training, the Decimator shield is a viable wonder weapon that's actually pretty unique and fun to use, and the wunderwaffe returns from Shinonuma if you want a weapon that's more traditional. The rest of the mechanics are largely the same as Shinonuma, which is actually a better foundation than I think most people will give credit for. In a vacuum, the Archon rises to the level of mediocrity, but doesn't do much else. It's almost similar to what it's like playing a World at War map now. It has the skeleton of what makes a decent map, but nostalgia withstanding, there's not a whole lot to keep you engaged for long periods of time. If the developers had the funding and resources to add various side Easter eggs, beef up the main quest and boss fight, and add in the details that made the series' golden age so special, it could have been a map worth coming back to and playing somewhat often. But because everything about Vanguard as a whole has been a colossal failure, that didn't happen. And that brings us to the Easter egg. The marketing for this map focused entirely on the Easter egg, and specifically the boss fight. The developers essentially said publicly that they didn't have the time or resources to make a good map or Easter egg, so they put all of their effort into the boss fight. Given that statement, you would assume the Easter egg itself is pretty slapdash, if it even exists at all. But as far as the steps themselves go, it's actually got some bright spots. The first phase of the Easter egg is where you enter the Dark Aether to confront Cortifex for the first time, and it's extremely simple and straightforward. You just do the Pack-a-Punch quest and interact with a podium that rises from the earth. After a long stretch of dialogue drowning in cliches, you teleport to the Dark Aether, and the game fakes you out by making you think this is part of the boss fight, only to be instantly downed and teleported back to the normal world for the next steps. I actually like what they did with this. It definitely fooled me the first time it happened. Aside from the fact that the dialogue can't be skipped and the content of the dialogue, this is all great for me. Where the Easter egg really shines is in the next phase, the trials. This phase consisted of 3 trials that you have to complete before re-entering the Dark Aether to battle Cortifex. And what I like about these trials is that they can be done in any order. I like the idea of being able to improvise in my game and let my preferred playstyle dictate what I do first, rather than being locked into a set of steps that have to be completed in a specific order. This is something I wish more Easter eggs did, especially the ones from Cold War and the rest of Vanguard. For as great as the non-linearity is, the steps themselves are extremely basic. The Trial of Sacrifice is entirely centered around combat, aside from one step which requires precise Molotov throws. The only quirk is that it requires the player to use Ring of Fire as their field upgrade, which I'm going to count as a positive, since this step and the boss fight provide the only reason to use a field upgrade that isn't Aether Shroud in the entirety of Vanguard. Otherwise, it's just killing zombies where the game wants you to. The Trial of Mindfulness is more or less a game of Simon Says that activates a soul box with an additional challenge that changes every attempt and ends with collecting a set amount of rune stones without killing zombies. It annoyingly has you skip through rounds several times to complete, but otherwise it's pretty uneventful. The Trial of Resilience has you collect a few items around the map and transport them back to a set location without the ability to sprint, as well as another randomized objective. After that, you'll be given the Decimator Shield to destroy siphon cores around the map. This objective is by far the best since it gives the player a guaranteed way to unlock the Decimator Shield in their game, but from a gameplay perspective, it's not all that noteworthy. And after that, you can enter the third and final phase of the Easter egg, the boss fight. Considering I called the second phase the highlight of the Easter egg while calling almost every objective uneventful, you can probably guess how I feel about the boss fight. If you read the marketing material and thought you were going to get a boss fight on the level of Mephistopheles from Infinite Warfare Zombies, then you're going to be sorely disappointed. This isn't even the most difficult boss fight in recent memory. Cold War has two boss fights that are far more difficult than this, with the Legion boss fight in Outbreak and the Valentina fight in Mauer Toten. The Cortifex fight is broken up into 3 phases, each of which resolve after shooting his singular weak point about 100 times while he does very little to stop you. The only attacks he has in the first phase are summoning about a dozen standard zombies, which does little more than replenish your ammo and armor, shooting a ball of red light at you that follows you around the map so slowly that you might forget about it, only for the meager amount of damage it actually does do to remind you have to move slightly to your left or right, and an attack that sets up what are essentially trip mines that I didn't even notice until I sat down to edit my last short form reviews. The second phase of the fight is identical to the first, except it's in a slightly different location, and Cortifex has a shield that makes him invincible. To break that shield, you have to break red crystals around the map, throw them inside a purple plant, wait 30 seconds for the plant to spit out a modified crystal, throw it into a giant rock floating in the sky, which will fly into the construct, and you can start the damage phase of the fight. While you're collecting and stocking up on these crystals, you'll be dodging the same unthreatening attacks from what is supposedly the most powerful being in the entire Dark Aether. The third and final phase of the fight is once again nearly identical to the prior phases, except this time Cortifex decides to add in a healing ability that he for some reason didn't find useful for the first 75% of the fight. The only change between this phase and the last one is that you have to put Cortifex into the damage phase more often to keep him from healing, which you should have been doing anyway if you're efficiently stocking up on crystals and understand the mechanics of the fight. Once again, there's very little worry of going down, as his attack patterns are entirely unchanged, with the only thing switching things up is another slight location change. Considering this is where they admitted all of the effort went, I have to assume the worst when guessing how much time the developers actually had to make this map, because there's not a lot here. There's potential to take the overall structure of this fight and make it something awesome. The size of Cortifex during the fight instantly reminded me of the Icon of Sin from the Doom games, and those fights are almost always challenging, engaging, balanced, and fun. Imagine instead of being locked into parts of the map, you had the entire Dark Aether to explore, and Cortifex moved around the island throughout the fight and attacked you with actual threatening attacks, while zombies were always around you. It could have been something great, but once again, it comes down to the developers plainly and obviously not having the tools needed to succeed. And while we're mentioning the Easter egg, the story is something else worth touching on, as this is something that signifies the developers' lack of resources. There are long stretches of dialogue throughout this Easter egg, especially early on, and all of that story information is done through voiceover. The Easter egg starts with Von List being separated from Cortifex as part of Cortifex's master plan. Von List is then teleported to Dr. Kraft's room, which, by the way, he's apparently been in a room somewhere throughout this entire game. Is it the room inside Durong Fong? Is it a room somewhere else? We'll never know. Either way, Kraft has Von List at gunpoint and is convinced to ultimately keep him alive to help us defeat Cortifex, who plans on erasing our dimension. This entire interaction is something I would love to see either as a pre-rendered cutscene or using the in-game assets. However, that didn't happen because there's no time or money for pre-rendered cutscenes, and there's not even an asset for either of these characters, since the only time we ever see them is through the picture that appears when they talk on the radio. Oh, and what happened to Kraft and Von List after Cortifex is defeated? Does Kraft kill Von List like he initially wanted to? Does it keep him as a prisoner of war for the Allied forces? What is the status of the war as a whole anyway? We don't know. The Easter egg ends with Cortifex being defeated, the screen fades to white, only for a small Cortifex model to fall into the abyss in the Dark Aether in the distant background of the boss fight arena. We never hear from Von List again, and we don't even really know if Cortifex is dead. His nickname is literally the Deathless. He could have just been removed from the construct. If anything, it makes sense that he would still be alive, because when you leave the Dark Aether, you can keep playing the map, and there are still zombies around in the real world. How are there zombies if Cortifex, the being responsible for their existence, is dead? Are the zombies sentient enough to live on after his death? Is this evidence that he's not really dead at all? Did anyone think the story of this game through at all? I can't stress enough that Vanguard Zombies doesn't have an ending. The game just runs out of plot and decides to stop. It's the equivalent of Lord of the Rings ending on the frame where the One Ring is destroyed inside of Mount Doom and Sauron is defeated. Like, imagine if that movie trilogy ended with Frodo and Sam still inside the volcano, hundreds of thousands of miles away from home, with none of the other characters having any kind of conclusion or resolution to their character arcs, or any kind of explanation as to what they're going to do now that their quest is over. That would be a load of shit. And that's what this map does. Beyond that, the map as a whole doesn't tie into the rest of the Dark Aether storyline in any way. The entire point of this game was meant to be a prequel to Cold War and tie into that story. But aside from the very existence of the Dark Aether, there's no connection to anything that happens in that game. My only assumption is that Treyarch's next title will have something to do with the Dark Aether, possibly relating to Cortifex or some other entity attempting to gain control of the construct, because that extremely vague and powerful force is still inside the Dark Aether, waiting for literally anyone else to complete its trials and become the most powerful being in the universe. Hell, we went through the trials in this map and they're not that hard. You know, come to think of it, we completed the trials and Cortifex was made into the Archon before that. Shouldn't the player character become the new Archon now that Cortifex is dead? Or at least now that he was defeated and not in the Archon anymore? What the fuck are the rules of this universe? So things went off the rails a little bit at the end. I mean, seriously, nobody expected me of all people to talk about this map's Easter egg and storyline for most of the video. But when the map is almost identical to a map they released last February, there's not a whole lot to talk about with the gameplay. And when the Easter egg and storyline fail this hard, it's hard not to talk about it. Despite how negative most aspects of this map are, it's honestly kind of difficult to rank. The initial inclination would be to throw it straight into F tier on any tier list. Largely forgettable Easter egg, underwhelming boss fight, baffling and unclear story, and it's the one-for-one remake of a map that they just released. Yeah, that sounds like F tier material to me, and I wouldn't blame anyone for putting this map into F tier. However, the way I structure my own tier list on this channel is that F tier needs to essentially give me the middle finger. The map either needs to make basic features like Pack-a-Punch inaccessible either through glitchiness like on Transit, over complex quests that exist solely for guides to be made on YouTube like on Dead of the Night, The Shadow Throne, or Beast from Beyond. It needs to be through poorly thought out gameplay decisions like Alpha Omega, Infection, The Torture Path, or Durong Fong and Terra Maledicta. And while you can make a surface level argument that the elements of this map make it an F tier map by those standards, the general gameplay in a vacuum and the context of the map's development don't really support that idea. So even though this isn't a tier list video whatsoever, and even though I've spoiled my first impressions for a lot of non-Treyarch Zombies maps since I still haven't made those live comms in Infinite Warfare and World War II Zombies yet, I promise those videos are coming. I'm getting back to them as soon as this one is done. For my own ranking criteria, this is and forever will be the benchmark to get out of F tier. The general gameplay is at least average, devoid of all context, and the lack of resources make it less of an insult and more of a victim of circumstance. The Archon is and forever will be the worst map in D tier. At least I hope to God we don't get anything worse than this. But those are just my thoughts. Of course, let me know what you think in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Like the video if you made it this far. Subscribe to the channel if you want to see more. And I'll see you in the next video. Take care.